what does it take to get you past the belief? Now, when I was in the remote viewing unit and I was learning coordinate remote viewing, I was, look, I'm a scientist. It's what I studied at university. And I've always been a believer in that. And I look for things in their empirical nature. And I like to, as a researcher, gather, collect, measure, analyze, right, report. That was what made me good as a staff officer in briefing and doing other things. But in the remote viewing unit, I stepped into it with the same degree of skepticism as anybody else would.
Spirituality and capitalism belong together. Those thoughts, those feelings, that comes from something bigger than I am. And together I believe we can all grow. That's how we're going to change the world. That's how we're going to change the planet.
Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to have you here.
I'm excited to be here.
For those people that don't know, we have Dr. Morehouse. And Dr. Morehouse has done some incredible things in life, but we're not going to get into that quite yet. But what I want to get into, you served a long time in the military, correct?
20 years.
20 years is not a short time. And you were also one of the most elite soldiers there are, which would be a Ranger. Right. Last night over dinner, you talked to me a lot about this, but some of the things I want to get into. So I've been building AI out as far as from a software perspective over the last 2 years. And I thought I had seen a lot of stuff when it came to AI. But last night when we talked, you shared some things with me that I'm still trying to process. And I believe that I thought I knew a lot about technology. But after our conversation, there's a lot more than you know than I don't know. So what I would like for you to do is tell the viewers at home, like, what is really going on with technology from a perspective of what's going on in the military, what's going on in the world that we're just not really aware of at the moment when it comes to, the advancements of technology.
Sure. I think probably the biggest innovation that is most frightening for me and other people is just the placement of AI into weaponry. And the military has been, for the last 30 years, really trying to figure out how to pull humans out of weapon systems, because humans involved in that, like putting fighter pilots into fighter aircraft, it requires that you have to train them, which is very expensive, and educate them. You have to take care of their families. You have to make sure that they have crew rest and are able to cycle through in that. You have to hope they don't get killed or wounded, because then you have to take care of them and take care of their families. And, the generals want to get and remove them from that process. So you saw that start to happen with drones.
Right.
So you have now pilots who can sit like Creech Air Force Base, which is north of Las Vegas, and pilots are reporting there in their tan Nomax flight suits. They go into a little cubicle and they sit down, and the actual drone is at an air base in Afghanistan, or it was in Iraq, and they fly it from Creech Air Force Base. And they're flying it through satellite technology all the way over there, and they're flying it so they're not in the combat. They're flying wherever they need to fly, and when somebody tells them to punch a hole in a building or something with a Hellfire missile, they just launch it from right there. So they fly it, they land it, and it's so remote it's hard for people to even understand that. But now what's really going is we're trying to build, and we are building, warplanes, bombers, and fighters that don't have people in them. That means you can go faster. You can build hypersonic aircraft then. And with the hypersonic aircraft, which has always been a huge pursuit, the difficulty there is actually getting a pilot to be able to withstand the G-forces of hypersonic flight. Changes the dynamics of everything in terms of flight control systems and other stuff, because pilots can't pull the G's that now the aircraft can. So if you can remove the pilot from it, you can go faster, you can turn harder. But now what they want to do is not have that flown by somebody remotely. They want to put AI into it and then have AI operate autonomously and decide whether it should kill something in a pursuit or whether it should do this or do that. And I know people feel comfortable that you can put the parameters in the AI that might prevent that kind of stuff from happening, but there is always that chance that that's not what will occur, or that somebody could hack it in some way and cause it to start doing that.
I've seen some. I watched a documentary a while ago where they were showing how they could actually get a jet. These pilots, right? We're talking AI pilots. From a perspective of inside the computers, where they were starting to show how these jets were doing things that human beings had never done before.
Yeah.
And I know that technology absolutely exists. And so I think that AI can, and I do believe can absolutely help impact humanity. And I also believe on the other side that AI could obviously destroy humanity.
I agree.
On both sides.
And we're doing the same thing with warships. I mean, ships that used to have 3,000 men on them are, gradually over the decades have been tailored down to where you've got 85 in a destroyer. I mean, I don't know that much about the Navy weaponry, but I do know that the modern warships that are on, in being built and the ones that are being planned for decades down the road are going to have less and less sailors on board. And ultimately, the objective is to have warships cruising the waters or hostile waters or just patrolling and protecting that have AI driving them and deciding. Same thing for submarines. Pull the human element out of all of it and put in AI. And we've been moving that way for decades, and they're going to keep doing it. And they will ultimately achieve it. But then it's going to go even further. It'll be AI tanks. It'll have AI other vehicles, logistics. They already have a helicopter that is driven by AI that has the ability to come in. And what it is it's a medevac aircraft. So it will come in, hover, land, find the appropriate place to land. Medics will pull the wounded up, open up the clamshell on this thing, put somebody in it. That would have to be a little disconcerting, I would say, if you were a wounded soldier. But put them in there, button them in, close the clamshell again, and push the button, and it picks up and flies back to base, where they'll bring them into the next, into the surgical hospital, wherever that might be. They're doing it for everything. They're even going right on down to weapons systems, meaning vehicles, tracked vehicles and wheeled vehicles that will have heavy machine guns on them or other kinds of weaponry, and it will decide where it's best route through the terrain, what are targets, what are not targets, where friendlies might be or not be, and it will fire as it sees fit to destroy the targets.
And it's not just the U.S. I'm assuming this is throughout the entire world from different forms of military. And so we're shifting the way that warfare is going to be, I think, seen in the next 10, 15, 20 years. You were saying something last night to me as we were having dinner, and that was, my brain is still thinking on this one, that we're able to take soldiers and we're able to take Humvees and we're able to take items, and basically, we're sitting here on the Earth, which gets a little odd. We're sitting here on the Earth and we can take these soldiers and we can put them in space. And then we can have them land within 15 minutes anywhere on the Earth, from what I understand.
Well, yeah. And now that has been part of a plan that started in December of 1945, when a 50-year plan, so obviously it's exceeded that, but a 50-year plan to develop the next dimension of war, which is space. And while we were doing it, the Soviet was doing it as well, and the Chinese caught up. About 15 years later. They didn't really catch up, but they started. And so now they're working very hard as well. And of course, as we know, they have an agreement with Russia. So they share tech. They buy it back and forth amongst each other. And they're trying to build their space platforms as well. And if the idea is something we talk about openly, which we do, that we want to put platforms in space where we can loiter vehicles and weapon systems and ammunition, logistics, medical supplies, that kind of thing, and call that down wherever we need it. out of space, because you have the speed of the planet rolling underneath that storage facility that's up in space. So at the speed of the planet's rotation, it's it's thousands of miles per hour. Whenever you have to deploy that, you can deploy it, and it'll be there 30 minutes at the most. And the intent also is eventually to loiter special ops teams in those areas. So you fly them up. It won't be like the ISS. It'll be, it's going to end up being something completely different. It could be these new dirigibles that they're putting up in space that have massive capabilities to haul and stay long term. They're self-sealing fabrics so that micrometeors and other meteors, when they punch through this thing, it seals itself, and it just never runs out of lighter than air gas, whether it's some new synthetic, exotic kind of lighter than air gas, or whether you're just using helium. But the idea is to put special operations teams there. So if you have to react to something, once you find it and you fix it, and your effort to kill it, you can just deploy that team from space.
My my belief is that there's a place and time where we're going to be able to enter where we will no longer have to be at war with each other. We'll no longer have to kill each other. We'll no longer have to try to control each other. And we can have a world where we're creating harmony, or as I always say, we create heaven on earth first. But last night over dinner, and I'm not going to get into all the details because I don't think that, the details we went into last night, the whole world doesn't need to know this. But what you shared with me last night, because you have been in special forces, and the things you have seen, and the things you have experienced, and the things that you have worked with men to accomplish throughout this world. Last night you called it the web of evil. And you said that throughout the world, there's many people that are always trying to destroy the republic, meaning they're trying to take away the freedoms here in the United States. They don't like the United States. They're angry at the United States, and they really want the power. And so they're willing to do anything they can to destroy it, which is kill men and women and children and whoever it takes to be able to get this initiative across the board, right? And how, I guess for me, it was more so how, as an individual, I realized last night something really drastic. And that was, I want to perceive the world one way and see the world one way. But you have seen the world very differently for 25 plus years in your life. Like, your view of the world versus my view of the world is so different. And we talked about last night how you have to objectively to be able to look at things, right? You can see it from one side or the other. And when looking at it from that perspective, I realized like how much privilege, truly, that I have to be able to do the things I do, experience the things I experience, build the things I build, be around the people I'm around, and have my mindset the way it is, and to be able to truly pursue whatever it is I want to, including, my right for spiritual beliefs, or my rights in business, or as a human being, or how to express myself, due to men like you. And first, I want to say thank you for that. But I realized what true privilege meant last night, that I get to view the world this way versus the way that you have had, the way you've had to truly see the world this way to be able to protect the Republic.
I, as a special operations infantryman, well, thank you, first of all, for thanking me for my service. I would do it again for free if anybody would ask me.
That's what you told me last night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had a unique career. I mean, I was privy to things that most officers of my rank weren't. For example, being taken as a general's aide with Fred Warner to go to El Salvador and to start to understand what happens when you're in a place and you're invited to help stem the tide of communism in that country back during the war in El Salvador, and you are able to sit in meetings with your general, with Ambassador Dean Hinton. You're staying in his house. You're hearing the conversations that are going on between the general and him. You start to see country team meetings where you have the chief of station, who is CIA, the Mill Group commander, who is responsible for coordinating U.S. forces with Salvadorian forces to fight communist guerrillas. You have the hierarchy of a church, which is always very dominant in that part of the world, who is there in this meeting. And you have, as a young officer, you're sitting there thinking, what role does that guy have here? Why is he in here? But he's part of the team. He's part of the dialogue. And you hear them strategizing, all of them. I mean, right on down to who's going to approach who when, and what they like to drink, and then what they're going to say, and who's going to step in next. So to say something. And the whole reason was to get certain ministers in that country to be able to influence the president of that country to follow suit with some of the ideas that we had put forward to expedite the war there and to help stop the communist flow there. And it was just bizarre as a young officer to see and to hear that. And it kept happening. You go to Uruguayan Command and General Staff College and you're hearing the dialogues there. You go to all these different things. I was part of the School of Americas, which had a really horrible, dark past. But with a previous general that I was an aide to, I was there with him all the time, sitting in the briefings, hearing what was going on and what they were going to be doing. That stuff is cumulative, and it builds up a degree, a bed of knowledge that's just not something that most young lieutenants get to experience or hear. And then by the time you become a company commander, now there's just more that gets stacked on that you see and hear. Going and sitting, in briefings with the Commander-in-Chief Southern Command. And then it just goes on up. So commanded an airborne rifle company in Panama, as well as an airborne rifle platoon, and then go to the Ranger Battalion and command in the Ranger Battalion for 2 years. And I'm assigned there for 5 years, going on 6. Come out of there and all that you experienced there, down in the countries in which you were either there as a show of force just outside Nicaragua, or you were down there doing something and with 3rd of the 7th Special Forces and Contras that were being recruited and trained, and efforts you had in moving them. You see the CIA there. You know that they're all over in the country. It's just an awakening and an awareness that so many young soldiers don't ever get to see. And then going into 3, probably the most classified top secret special access programs that the Army has. And this is the place where you, more than ever, you now begin to see the enormity of the evil that we confront every day. Not me. I mean, I was, again, just a member of a special access program. But I had the visibility on it and could sit in the briefings or talk to the operations guys or operators. But the people who work in that world, particularly who have the electronic capability like at NSA or DIA or CIA, they see the world and that fabric of evil at a scale that nobody else could actually ever fathom. You just have no idea how deep it goes, how complex it is, how interwoven it is, that just attaches everywhere. And it's taxing for them. You have to really give them heart and appreciation, almost more than somebody like me, absolutely more than somebody like me, because I was a special operations soldier. They are the ones that have to deal with that every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. There are men and women in some cubicle at the helm protecting the nation. They're not there to disrupt you or to follow you. They're there to protect the nation. And they do it very well. And if they blink, something bad happens.
Yeah, it's what you were saying last night. And so I wanted to cue that up, right? I wanted to just get a little bit of your background, where you came from, and you've experienced some very horrific things. And at one point in time, you have told me that you had been, shot many times and shrapnel and all of these different things. But there was a point in time where the story kind of shifts from this place of protection from a military side of things with, we'll call it force, or with true violence. Then something happens and you end up getting shot, correct?
I was hit in the helmet. It wasn't a wound to my head. It was struck my helmet in the Kingdom of Jordan. I was training Jordanian Rangers to, well, let's just review the bidding there. Who would Jordanian Rangers be gearing up to kill? It was Israelis. So we were there training Jordanian Rangers to kill Israelis without that ever being stated. The only other thing they had concerns about in the area were Syrians. They'd had some skirmishes with Syrians before, but that's what we were there to do. And in one of the training exercises, which was live fire, a Jordanian machine gunner, which we had attached to the platoon's support by fire position, he shifted his fire the opposite direction of where he was told to shift it. And he put about 75 to 100 rounds of 7.62 out of an M60 machine gun sweeping through the assault element of the platoon that I was walking with because I'm evaluating the young lieutenant, right? And so fortunately, none of my men were hit, although tops of canteens were shot off and holes through their blouse and that kind of thing. But I was hit in a helmet with a round traveling 2,832 feet per second. And so it took me off my feet because it wasn't a ricochet. It was a direct hit into the helmet, and it didn't skip off the helmet. The Kevlar caught it in between the layers of the Kevlar. So it just pulled me off my feet. And during the time I was knocked out or unconscious on the ground, I don't know how long I was out. The stories varied from medics to privates, so I don't know. Let's just say 15 minutes maybe. And during that time, as soon as it happened, I just remember looking at the back of the lieutenant's hand because he was keying the handset on the mic because we knew we were taking fire. And we had thrown out the smoke signal to shift the fire, and he was giving the verbal OPSCAD to shift the fire. And at that time, I just remember watching his hand, the back of his hand, key the mic, and then it was black. And when it was black, it was like the television channel changed in my head. And I found myself in a place that felt like the desert, but I sensed a temperature change, and there was something there that was giving me a message, and it was a being.
And what was that message?
The message was that you have chosen the wrong path in life. You are to choose a new path in life. Now, I have called that many things, an angel's apparition, whatever it could be. But I now know, as I've matured with this understanding of what takes place beyond the physical, that really what that was me talking to me. And I think that happens more often than.
What part of that was speaking to you, though? Like from where?
It's a piece of my consciousness, and it was
you're
speaking truth to me, that truth that I had pretty much masked for myself all those years, because I was, as I said to you, one of the things I found out, because that began a long journey of transition, is that just simply because you do something really well, or because you've been trained almost every day of your life by a father who was an Army officer, a grandfather who was an Army officer, that you have a tendency to accept that as your purpose in life because it was spoon-fed to you.
Yeah, from an ancestral perspective.
Sure. And even though, initially at university, I wasn't really sure that's what I wanted to do, but then you ultimately end up choosing that path, and you find that everything comes so easy and naturally to you there that you get recognized and you get awarded and you get promoted and et cetera. So, I started off coming out of university as being the distinguished military graduate at BYU, but also was selected by the Ralph D. Mershon Award, which is the #1 cadet commissioned into the regular Army in the nation. A huge distinction. So you start to think like, oh, well, I guess this is what I'm supposed to be doing, right? And I loved every minute of it. I mean, there were times where you were wishing you weren't sleeping in a swamp, but you really loved every minute of it.
Right.
Especially the men, especially the troops. There was nothing that made me prouder than being with them, and it was just my privilege to serve with them and to lead them. But
Yeah, it's one of the things I've noticed about you in your career and in your life is it really is a life of service. But so you have what I call an awakening, right? That's what I'm going to call this. You get hit in the head, you hear this voice. Some could call it a higher source, some could call it self, some could call it the higher self. It doesn't really matter, but there's something inside of you that all of a sudden you hear this voice. You tell your psychologist what's happening, right?
you're not my psychologist.
No, it's not your psychologist.
No, when I left the Rangers, which after I turned over my company command, you now are looking for your next assignment. I had an assignment picked up where I was supposed to go to the Defense Language Institute to learn to speak Italian, and then I was going to be sent to Vicenza, Italy, and I was going to be an aide to an Italian general. Would have been my third general, which was kind of odd, but it had worked for me so far, so I was okay with that. The day I changed command, the battalion commander at the 1st Ranger Battalion, Keith Nightingale, came over and said, "I'm sorry, you're not going to Defense Language School, and you're not going to go to Italy. The Italian general chose an American officer in country that already spoke the language." That was a bad thing because now I'm a free agent. I'm a free agent that has 2 company commands, has all of these special skills, from combat diver to jump master to pathfinder to everything. And now any assignment officer looking for a captain that they want to stuff into something and get something filled, and they need that level of officer expertise, you can't get out of it. So my fear was I was going to go to recruiting command, which would have been horrible, or I was going to go to ROTC duty, which maybe that wouldn't have been horrible, but it wasn't something I wanted to do. Or you go to reserve component duty, or maybe Army National Guard as an active duty advisor and all of that. None of those things were things that I wanted to do. So some officers, senior officers, pulled some strings, and I ended up going to Washington, D.C. to be interviewed for a very bizarre organization I didn't know existed until I got there, but it was codenamed Royal Cape. It's also called The Activity. There's a book that was written in the last 10 years called Killer Elite. Interesting book. Tells you everything about that unit. So I have no idea how that guy got cleared to write it, or that somebody got cleared to give him all the information, because it's a unit that supports clandestine and covert military operations in Tier 1 and Tier 2 countries. And it is a unique position. It's codenamed Orange. It's its code color. And it still exists. And I was there as the deputy executive officer. So I was briefing John O. Marsh Jr., the Secretary of the Army, like 3 times a week, and briefing him on the operations within this organization, because the organization got into some trouble years earlier when it was told by John O. Marsh Jr. that you will not send somebody to this particular place, but then at a cocktail party, he found out that they went ahead and did that anyway. So he drew a line around the Pentagon, and the organization was at Fort Belvoir, and he said, if you move anywhere outside that 50-mile radius of the Pentagon, you have to have written orders from me. Now, that meant if somebody was going to go on leave, they had to be written orders, or if they were going to deploy into a country to start operating there or something else, you had to have that. But one of the things that that came out of that unit that became so disruptive to me was just looking not only at, I understood the mission and I understood why the organization existed, but I was at that time a high priest in the LDS church. And I was active in the church at that time. I'm not now, but I was active then.
Were you, so question about that, right? We've had a couple people on the show that were LDS. Obviously we're close to Utah and so on.
Yeah.
But was that before or after the run-in with the bullet?
After.
And that's when you started then looking for something like more than or bigger or something that you were trying to make sense of all this? Or
no, it's that's why I wanted to tell you this piece of the story, because it's kind of shocking. But I already told you about the use of church authority in El Salvador and throughout Central and South America. But now I'm sitting in this organization and I know exactly what the organization does. And I see, as the deputy executive officer, a series of orders that I have to brief John O'Marsh Jr. to get him to sign. And there are soldiers that are not LDS. And what is happening is they are bringing them to the language training mission in Salt Lake City. And then through the training that they give to missionaries, missionary training center.
At the MTC, yeah.
Right. And I immediately go back into the skiff to the lieutenant colonel, who is LDS, who's put this together. And I said, we're taking guys that are not LDS. We're taking them through the whole process to turn them into a missionary, to make them look like a missionary, and then send them into countries to gather and collect or try to build support infrastructures and pulling intel out while they're pretending to be LDS missionaries. Now, when you're at BYU and your roommate who came back from a mission says, yeah, they thought we were all CIA down there. And now you start to understand why
they said that, right?
Why they're saying that, right? So I couldn't believe it, but they were doing that. And I got really upset about it. So I wrote a letter to the First Presidency of the Church, because the lieutenant colonel said that they were witting, that they were supporting this. So I wrote a letter to the First Presidency of the Church, and I laid out who I was and what I now know, and I demanded an explanation. Well, it's much like the CIA. They're not going to admit to anything, so they don't even answer you, right? Because if they answer you, it either it's telling me that they do know that and they are doing that, which would have been devastating to the church, right?
Right.
And so I, 6 months later,
well,
wrote
and not
another
to
one.
mention putting in all of those missionaries that were not there for those purposes in a lot of danger.
Sure.
Like, I could see both sides of that.
Right. So no response to the next one. And so I just was really I was disgruntled about that. Not only that the nation was employing them in that way, that we were using them in that way, but that the church was allowing that to happen, knowledgeable about it. And another thing is, throughout the years, just talking to church members and saying, throwing this out, being completely taken aback by it myself, you'd find that people would go, well, if that's what the country wants, if that's how the country wants to use them, it's okay. And I couldn't understand that logic either. And I had been, in a first presidency of a ward, and I'd also been in the first presidency of a stake, serving in those capacities. And it really backed me off for a while. Now, you were talking about the psychologists. This particular organization was unique. It had a command psychologist, lieutenant colonel, who was assigned to the organization. And the reason that is there is because they needed somebody to keep their finger on the psychiatric pulse of the organization.
Which makes sense after a lot of stuff we've talked about.
Yeah. I mean, alcohol consumption goes up when people are in those places. Divorce rates go up.
Yeah, I think last night you were telling me that if you're a ranger, it was 50% divorce in the first year. And then after that, I think it's close to like 95% because of the things that those men went through. To go home and try to just shut that off is a pretty difficult thing to do.
It's the deployments. I mean, it's hard enough to be a good father and to be, and to be a good husband if, under those circumstances anyway. And I certainly failed in that capacity, but, and some managed to do it, but it's the deployment times. Even as a Cold War warrior in that respect, I was gone 10 and a half, 11 months out of the year. I mean, that doesn't allow you to be too influential in your kids' lives, right?
Right.
So, and they just have a lot of difficulties. Plus, you're living in a world where you're seeing things that are outside the scope of what most people see. And people who come up through combat arms are not necessarily well suited to suddenly be working in, this offshoot of an intelligence service.
Right.
Right.
So moving back to where you had this individual that was obviously working with you guys, paying attention to your guys' mental health, making sure everything's moving forward. So what happens then?
Well, you have to do a counterintelligence polygraph. Every so many months, they do a CI poly and make sure you're not giving secrets away to somebody or selling them or anything else. And part of that, as soon as you came out of the poly, part of the checklist was you sat down with a psychologist, the command psychologist, and he had a series of questions that he would ask you. And then he always ended it with his final question was, is there anything else you would like to talk about or say, which was kind of creepy the way he did it. And so I think it was in my second or third encounter with him, I shared with him what happened when I got shot in the helmet out in Jordan. And that was the fuse, the trigger that ended up him doing this very slow read on, which means in intelligence speak, it means they don't tell you if they're going to recruit you into a new unit, they don't tell you what that unit does 100%. Because if you then turned around and said, hell no.
Right. Now you know a lot.
Now you know a lot, and they can't take that back.
Right.
So they move it along, and then they watch you very carefully, see how you respond. So over the next 6 months or so, plus minus, I was recruited into this new special access program, which was at that time called Sunstreak, and had been known by a lot of other code names. And it was the remote viewing, the Army's remote viewing team that worked for the CIA and the DIA, Directorate of Technology and Science.
Yeah, this is where it gets fascinating to me, because now we're talking about something that a lot of people at home, one, may not know what it is, and they might not even believe it. But when we're looking at remote viewing, how many millions and millions of dollars and time and energy was put into that program? There's obviously something there. And you worked in that unit for how long?
3 years.
So 3 years. And during that period of time, you were able to learn a lot about obviously what remote viewing is, so much so that eventually you wrote a book, and then eventually you started teaching, 33,000 people remote viewing?
Oh, yeah, over the decades when I started teaching in 95, because I actually taught all over Europe, taught in the UK first, and I taught for 5 years there before ever teaching a class in the US. So that didn't happen until I busted my buns, teaching all over Sweden, Norway, Germany, France, Denmark, the UK.
Because before that, though, you were on your way, I believe, to becoming a general, right? But before you decide to take this,
I had
to go do
deficiency
remote
reports where general officers had written, destined to wear stars, could be chief of staff of our army one day, things like that. That's very unusual.
But you were telling me last night, like a lot of the people that were in different units, people that are much higher up are saying, you are a complete idiot for doing this. It's going to destroy your military career. Like literally, like if you do this thing, it's over. Like you're never going to go back to where you were before, because people are not, they're going to think that you're going with these freaks and these weird people. And why would you be doing that? So why did you do that?
Well, it's a good question. I was intrigued. The idea that there was a way to actually experience, still as an Army officer, and fully embrace and understand if there was something beyond the physical. Remember, I was a believer because I was in a church and I was in a hierarchy of that church. So it means that you believe that there is life after this life and that there is life before this life. And so now, in an answer to that belief, right, here's a potential to step into something that the CIA is involved in and the Directorate of Technology and Science, the chief scientist of the DIA, Jack Verona, is the oversight scientist for this. It was proven in science at Stanford Research Institute International in Palo Alto, right? Over a sole source contract that went on for over 30 years, off and on, little bits and things and renewals and stuff. So people can doubt the reality of it, but I really don't care about that. And that's kind of the approach that the CIA had as well. And it's the approach that, the chief of staff for intelligence for the Army adopted, and for, the commander of INSCOM at the time. They couldn't have cared less about the detractors, and there were plenty of them. But those are people who choose to believe, again, that there's nothing beyond the physical, or that there's no way that this could be real. Or there were also those, believe it or not, that believed that their church and their religion would not support something like this, that it had to be evil, it had to be occult. And so therefore, why was their army allowing that to be utilized in some way?
Yeah, especially in a world, United States is primarily, now we're a melting pot of so many different belief systems and religions and so on. But at a point in time, it was a lot more, I would say, focused on Christianity. Even on the American dollar, it's in God we trust. Now, it depends what God we're talking about here. But when we're looking at that and we're looking at remote viewing, there are a lot of viewers, there are a lot of listeners that have no idea what remote viewing is. They're probably the first time they've ever heard that. Now, I know we don't have hours to go over remote viewing.
Yeah, we don't want to spend a lot of time on that.
I get that. But enough that people at home understand, what was going on and what was the purpose of it.
Well, it was being developed as an intelligence collection tool, and it was successful at that. It happened at a time in the Army when the ground was ripe for something like that.
About what year was that?
No, the first reports that the Soviet and the Chinese were scraping, people that were declared or natural or known clairvoyants and clairaudients, or psychics, if you will.
Right.
People with ESP that had been recognized in their communities, and they were pulling them and getting them together. And there were also there were reports that they were harvesting children that had these abilities or came from relatives with those abilities, and they were going to bring them in and test them and train them and utilize them as an intelligence collection asset, or maybe something else, right?
Yep.
So when that became known in the CIA, it was 72 now, and now look at the conditions. Where were we? Had come through the Vietnam War, and it's dwindling down. We're withdrawing troops, right? They haven't taken over Saigon yet, but we are pulling out, and everybody knows it. The Army was in a shambles. It was absolutely, they did away with the draft, and they started the VOLAR, all-volunteer Army. They didn't know how that was going to work because they hadn't done anything like that in so long. The country was in an uproar coming out of the 60s, and here we are in the early 70s, and it certainly hadn't healed, and it was very angry, riots in the streets and everything going on. So they started looking for, how are we going to rebuild the Army? What are we going to do with it? How are we going to change the focus of it? So you also had lots of other things taking place at that time. You had, new developments and like organizational effectiveness training was one of the things that came into being. The Army finally got smart and did away with that in the 80s, but up to that time, they were starting that. It was a whole university training center where they were certifying non-commissioned officers and officers to be organizational effectiveness leaders, and big brainstorming sessions and sensing sessions and all this other stuff, which was worthless because, for Pete's sake, it's an Army hierarchy. You're not going to have a colonel sitting in a meeting, a sensing session, and have some E5 or E6 change the direction of how he's going to lead that battalion, right, or lead the brigade. So there are lots of pieces of paper up on the wall and lots of ideas getting tossed around. lots of things going on for 2 days at a time, and then ultimately a general or a full colonel or a lieutenant colonel gets to sit there and go, yeah, no, not doing that.
So
Gonna
we're
do
really
this.
in the military at that point in time. We're using, in a way, we're using spiritual warfare in war. I mean, literal warfare.
It goes beyond that. It was exactly when they formed what was called Task Force Delta, which is not Delta as everybody knows it. It was Task Force Delta was a huge combined civilian and upper echelons of the military think tank that was pulled together to start deciding what they were going to do. That's kind of where the OE stuff came out of and other things. Lieutenant Colonel Channon, now passed away, the guy that was the brunt of the joke of, the men who stare at goats. He forms the 1st Earth Battalion. Well, there was nothing funny about the 1st Earth Battalion. It was absolutely dead serious. And it's still spoken of in good terms in special operations communities, like in the SF, which are Green Beret. And the first time I ever heard anything or saw anything about it was the day I walked in to 1st the 75th Ranger Battalion. I was in the S3 shop as the assistant S3 operations officer. There was a 1st Earth Battalion training manual in the rack there, along with all the other field manuals and everything else. That was the first time I looked through that. So that stuff was, they were going to have an entire brigade that was capable of doing that stuff. Now, it sounds weird, but remember, they're trying to figure out what next and how do we do something next powerfully and make a difference? How do we become more spiritual? And how do we serve the nation with honor and dignity and sharpen our warrior skills, but at the same time, live powerfully and as an example, so that if we have to step into some developing country where 2 belligerents are going at it, instead of us going in there and participating with one side or the other, to step in such a countenance that we would actually neutralize the 2 belligerents or potential belligerents. And that was kind of the idea of what they wanted to do with that. So all of these things, it was when Boyd came forward with the Boyd cycle, the observe, orient, decide, and act, the OODA loop, which now if you Google OODA loop, you'll see like 250,000 different websites that reference it and have it on there. And this was an Air Force captain, later went on to become a general in the Air Force, but he never lost an air-to-air engagement. It was phenomenal, and he never lost a simulated air-to-air engagement, meaning he was thinking faster than the computer that was driving the simulated air-to-air engagement, or whoever was driving it from behind the panel. So they studied him. They wanted to know how he was capable of doing it. And, I'll give you the short explanation. He entered, a wakeful, altered state of consciousness where he was able to see what his enemy was, what his opponent was going to do before his opponent did it. And in reacting to that, so it was observe, orient, decide, and act. That meant he wasn't chasing the opponent in the air. He was putting his aircraft into an attack attitude where he was pulling the trigger and the opponent flew into the gun target line. And it was phenomenal. And so they were studying that and putting that together. You see where I'm going with this? There were so many
it
things.
Seems like
that were
there
just
was a lot of things going on that time, because when you're doing remote viewing, you're basically, from what I understand, you're in a room, you're putting yourself in a state, and you're able to, which we're going to get into in a second here, but you're able to use, we'll say, the holographic field, move through the holographic field to be able to pull in data points.
It's a dogma. It's a 6-stage process for extracting information from a holographic matrix field, but you're using your mind.
Right.
And you're going into an alpha brainwave state to do the work. You're detecting, decoding, and objectifying. You're detecting 8-dimensional waveform. You're decoding it in a 4-dimensional biological brain that utilizes its lexicon from its experience in this life. So it decodes it at the speed of thought, And then you are objectifying it on 2 dimensions, on a piece of paper, capturing verbal sensory data and visual sensory data. Now, that's the plain, down and dirty, simple aspect of this thing. The definition given by the CIA was the learned ability to enter an altered state of consciousness, to transcend space and time, to view persons, places, or things, remote in space and time, to gather and report intelligence information on the same, or some variant of that.
I mean, I think it's a perfect way of explaining it, right? So basically finding a target, utilizing, as you said, your consciousness or an altered state to be able to find what it is you're looking for from an intelligence perspective. So you go through all that for 3 years, but then something shifts and you decide to write a book and you decide to let the whole world know about the potential of human beings. And from what I understand, the reason you do that, correct me if I'm wrong here, is because you want to show humans, you want to show people just who they really are, how powerful they are, how magnificent they are. Because there's way more to this reality than what we actually can see. But you said something to me last night, and that was how many people believe, or how many people basically believe in God, or how many people believe in something further than here. And then, lots of hands go up, right? And I was in the room last night. And then you said about how many people want to know. And there's such a difference in belief versus knowing. And that's so damn powerful. Like, we can all think something or feel something or experience something, but until you know something, it's a whole different ballgame. I've got a good friend of mine, and he'll say, how do you, I can read a book on what it's like to have a baby, right? I'm a man. I'm never going to have a baby. But a woman that brings the baby into this world throughout the birth canal, she knows what that's like, which is a whole different ballgame. And what you're telling me is that people can utilize remote viewing as a way to know that there's something much more beyond this veil and just how powerful we are as human beings.
Let me give you an example. Somewhere back around 1972, maybe a little bit later, because it was a CNN study, so I don't know when CNN came into existence, but there was a CNN study, and I was on an aircraft, and it had been published in one of the aircraft magazines that I was looking at. And the study had 2,000 respondents, so of significant in the pool, right? And they asked 2 questions. The first question they asked was, who believes in something beyond the physical? Didn't have to declare it as God or anything else. You just had to say yes or no. And out of that 2,000 respondents, 98% of the respondents said, I believe that there is something beyond the physical, whatever that means. 2% said, we believe that there is nothing beyond the physical. The operative phrase here is believe. One set believes, and it's a significant set, and another minor set believes not. Throughout the entire, history then from there forward about whether we have this ability or we don't have this ability, you go on some television show or you write a book or do something else, it's always this 2% that's elevated up to be equal in terms of the power of their opinion as dissenters to the 98%. But that was not the most important thing out of this. The next thing was those 2% didn't get asked the next question. But the next question was, okay, so you believe that there's something beyond the physical. Do you believe that you can ever recognize it, that you could be part of it, that you can interact with it, learn from it, contribute to it, essentially? Now, that 98% expressed as 100, what happens is there's 76% of them come back and say, no, I don't believe I will ever recognize it. I don't believe I'll ever interact with it, learn from it, or anything else. But I believe there must be something there, but I have no evidence that there is. I can believe that, right? But I don't have any evidence of it. So that was an interesting find for me. 24% come back and say, right, we believe there's something beyond the physical, and yes, we believe that we will interact with it, can learn from it, contribute to it, etc. that was very telling to me, because that was where I developed this understanding about belief and what does it take to get you past the belief. Now, when I was in the remote viewing unit and I was learning coordinate remote viewing, I was, look, I'm a scientist. It's what I studied at university. And I've always been a believer in that. And I look for things in their empirical nature. And I like to, as a researcher, gather, collect, measure, analyze, right, report. That was what made me good as a staff officer in briefing and doing other things. But in the remote viewing unit, I stepped into it with the same degree of skepticism as anybody else would. It really had to be a show me. And so as the training progresses, you can cast doubt on your work constantly, as I'm sure everybody did. And especially for me, I had to be trouble for them, because I didn't consider myself clairvoyant. I didn't get brought into there as they did, because they had made that statement and then they get recruited to do that. I just saw myself, okay, this is where I'm assigned now. And I signed up for it. And yes, you were correct. I was told don't go there, because if you go there, you're just entering an organization of misfits and freaks, and you're never going to recover from this. It's going to damage your career irreparably. But I wanted to go because I wanted to know. And I thought if there was ever going to be a doorway that would let me see if there is or there isn't, this would be it. Understanding the science, the background, and where it came. This wasn't something developed, in a back room with a beaded curtain by some starry-eyed New Age guru. This was something that came out of science, being fielded and paid for by most powerful intelligence agency in the world,
right? And
headed up and umbrellaed and covered by Directorate of Technology and Science of the Defense Intelligence Agency. This is not, if you're going to get into something to see and test the water, that was it as far as I was concerned.
That's what baffles me, right? How much money, how much time, how much energy, how much science was put into this program, right? So you said something a second ago, and that was the knowing or the understanding. And I can tell you from my own spiritual practices over the years, right? There's no quantifiable, there's no science behind it. It is only a feeling and a knowing and a deep experience of many things over many years. But I often will sometimes question, is what I'm experiencing real? Is it just internally in myself? Is there something beyond this reality? And I've experienced many things that say there's absolutely many things beyond this reality that is undeniable and unexplainable. But I think the difference in what you do is when you put a group of people in a room and majority of them come up with the same answer with something that seems so illogical. That's what I find so fascinating about all this stuff. So you eventually decide to let the public know about this because you want to show them how powerful they are. Now, why though? What's the purpose of?
You have to understand where I got to the place of knowing, and that was, it really was about 3 months into the 3 years, because the practice sessions where they're training you can. The first few times you're doing it, you can find ways to question it. You can find ways to turn around and say, well, I could have guessed that, or, maybe I saw something, maybe I didn't, because you're struggling. You're trying to find out what your modalities of perception are, which ones are major, which ones are minor. You're struggling with it all, and you are questioning, because I don't care how much you believe something, you can't know it. Because as you said right there, there's always that doubt light flashing behind your eye. No matter what your experience is in the practice, there's always that doubt until you have some empirical evidence based on an experience that you personally were involved in that now, okay? Now that light doesn't come on anymore. So I got to the point where I could not outrun the data. And the data, just compounds, and it's so accurate. And we're not looking at somebody telling us what's in my pocket, or what's in my shoebox, sitting on the table here. These are complex gestalts that you're looking at. These are very complex gestalts. So the amount of data that you're able to generate as you get better and more experienced with the structure, where you're not quibbling with the structure anymore. You dance with the structure. And now it is just, how much data can I harvest? How much verbal and visual data can I harvest? How much emotional, aesthetic, right? Intangible data can I harvest as you get through this thing? So you start to amass so much data. And then when you compare that data to the feedback, closing the training loop, you just get to the point where you can't argue it anymore. I mean, it's just impossible for you to, to just fabricate it.
And I agree with that, and that makes sense. But why? Like, why go? So you saw a lot of evil, and you're aware of a lot of evil. Is there something inside of you when you decided, like, hey, I want to let the world know about this? Is this something that you figure if you let the world know about it?
I wasn't at that point there.
Not there.
No, not at all. I was still a good soldier, and I was doing what I was doing. But what starts to happen? I was being trained. Okay.
Right.
When you're being trained, you're not working operational targets. So you're not working a rogues gallery. I mean, you're looking at things that they can, at those days, give you a Xerox copy of what they had you looking at. So when you start your declared operational, okay, now you're a spy. Now you're going to be working targets that whatever intelligence customer comes up with, and they task it out. It's called all source intelligence. So it goes to everybody. It goes to every collection asset that's out there. And they collect back in what everybody produces,
All
and
the
the
data
analyst
points.
assembles it.
Okay.
They develop an aggregate picture of what's there, and then determinations are made. Is it actionable? Is it not? Do we need more? Do we have to send them back again? So my first operational target, as I remember, was Flight 803 over Lockerbie, Scotland. Now, they just called everybody back in. Nobody knows what you're being called back in for. And then they start tasking you. Well, there's an emotional component to looking at something, even though you don't know it. As I described it the other day, it's like it feels like I'm saying it this way so people can understand what it might feel like. It's like getting punched in the heart, right? You're blindfolded because you don't know what the target is, and you get punched in the heart. So all you know is your heart hurts emotionally. It doesn't really physically hurt. The point is, it's an emotional
thing. Yeah, no, I got it.
So and then what they do is they look at they aggregate the data, they turn around and look at it again, and then they send you back. They'll take one component, a piece that comes out of it, or maybe another one. So now one series of targets with 8 viewers, it comes out. Now there are like 6 other targets that they now assign coordinates to, and you go back in and do that. It's still the same thing, but now they're interested in a little radio that was on the other side of the plane in front of the right wing that was sketched. Or they want to know the woman that was sitting on the plane that had a particular kind of a chocolate bar that was an explosive. All of that was confirmed later, many down the road. She was the backup. If the bomb didn't detonate, and why she was there doing that, why she did that is because her family was on the jetliner that was shot down by the U.S. warship in the Gulf when they were trying to they were protecting all the oil tankers and other things that were there. They were protecting them from the Iranian swift boats that were out there, shooting them up and trying to blow them up. So the U.S. Navy was there guarding that. And an Iranian airliner took off. And as it came out over the water, this warship acquired it and read it as a warplane headed for the ship. And the captain had to make a decision. So I guess our ability to determine friend or foe in those days was not all that good. And we fired a missile at that aircraft and took it down. It was a commercial jetliner. So as the story and the final analysis decades later is that's why she did it. That was determined by viewers that there was a connection between that airliner and not Flight 803, but the other one. So you just keep going back and back and back again, and you don't know why you're being chewed up emotionally, but they don't let you go home because they're working you on more targets than they're really supposed to or allow you to do, and it's not good for you to drive home like that. Then you can have somebody come and pick you up, but you can't drive home because you're still in an altered state of consciousness, and you've been doing it 3 targets or 4 targets a day for 90 minutes for a target session. That people, before I got there, they'd have someone go home who had been in that kind of a situation, and they would go, I'm on the Eastern Shore, and I don't know how I got here, right?
So they were, it was so real to them that they had no idea, like, however, I mean, I've never done it before, so I don't know what it's like, right? But it was so real to them that they actually had to decompress, we'll call it, to get back to this reality.
Yeah, the metaphysical term for it is grounding. You know, it's the ground. But
Makes
you're
sense.
right.
Yeah.
The better term that I would use is decompress. You've got to disengage from it. So, but you know, when they're working something like that, they're not interested in that. And also, there was no mechanism for that. They didn't have any kind of kinds of documents or studies or manuals that said this can be taxing on the viewers. You know, you can wear them out emotionally by doing this kind of stuff. So you're doing it over and over again. And, you know, okay, so that was a bad one. But
especially the targets you guys are picking, right? Like, you know, you could pick different targets, would obviously be a lot more, I would say, impactful from a place and time to maybe change humanity versus in a lot of stuff when it comes to intelligence. At least this would be
they didn't give a shit about that.
Of course they don't, right? That's not the objective on any level. But I want to speed things up a little bit, right? When you finally decide, like, come to that moment with me, when you finally decide that that there's something inside of you that snaps and says, I want to let the world know about this.
Yeah.
That's really
when
where
I
my
came out of the
curiosity is
unit,
at.
I had no intention of doing that. But what I came out of the unit was knowing that I knew that there was something beyond the physical, and I knew that I was part of it. What changed when that happened is because of all the things you're doing in the unit, it changes how you see the world. It changes how you see people because you're no longer bound by physical space and physical textures and surfaces. You can feel through people and see people in a different way. You have become hyper intuitive. And it manifests in many different ways. And it was far more impactful for a guy like me because I didn't come in there with that, right?
Right.
I didn't grow up thinking that was a capability for me. So for me, it was like discovering I had 2 new thumbs sewn onto one of my hands, you know, when I woke up. You're going to poke yourself in the eye with that, right? Because I had no idea. So it changed how I interfaced with my wife. It changed how I interfaced with my friends and how I interfaced in the church or how I interfaced with my children. It also changed how I saw officers and colleagues and other people. You start to see, you get to the point where when there's a narcissist, you know, a sociopath narcissist in front of you that happens to have 2 stars on, you can see that. And you start to become critical of them and their narcissistic tendencies and the fact that they don't really know what they want. They only know what they don't want when they see it, you know, which is ass backwards leadership as far as I'm concerned. And yet they're in a key position as a division commander. You see that, and you see lies, and you see betrayals, and you see all, you know, just petty crap going on. Something I never saw before because I chose not to see it.
Would you say, did remote viewing on any level heal you from the internal side of the things that you had experienced? Because a lot of people...
No,
not at all?
No.
There was nothing in that for you? There was not like a spiritual awakening? There was just more of a intuitive way for you to see the world in a... At
that point, yeah. I mean, at that point, well, the only place where I was with this is that I've now been changed by this. And at that time, I wasn't certain, and I would tell you very honestly, if you had asked me then, I would not have said that it was a positive thing because there was no way to, I had to mature into that. There was nobody that came up and put their arm around you and said, hey, let's talk about this, right? Let's talk about what's happening to you. Yeah? So you're on your own. And again, there's a difference between me and those that believed they had a natural ability when they walked in there. And also some of those folks had been there for 15 years in this unit. 15 years, some pushing 20. I mean, that's an entire career sitting in there doing that. I knew I wasn't going to do that because I needed to get back to troops again, which is what I wanted to do. And then I went from there into a strategic deception unit. And we don't need to talk about that, but that was an experience in and of itself. And then after that, Command and General Staff College, which that was kind of stabilizing. But even there, you find now that you're looking at things in totally differently. But I loved because I was learning there, and I got a master's degree and worked on a second master's degree. But then when I got back into the division, I enjoyed being at the battalion level, but I really despised being at the division staff officer level. And I just got to the point where I had the opportunity to write a book, and I had to ask myself, you know, they're going to come after you for this, right? And I knew they were. For some reason, I rationalized to myself that because of my career path and because of my previous record, right, that they wouldn't come after me hard. Like I figured, okay, you're certainly never going to get a brigade command. You're probably never going to make full colonel, 20 years might be it, and you're going to get out. But they came very hard. They came hard. They came at my family. They came at me. And I had made that decision in writing the book, not because I thought there was money in it, because there isn't, right?
Yeah.
And certainly not because I needed to be famous, because if you're seeking that kind of fame, that's not the right kind of fame, right?
Yeah.
So those decisions had nothing to do with it. I wanted to tell the story and link it to the intelligence world in the Army because it gave it credibility. Not the fact that I was telling a story, but if you're talking back again to, if you want to know instead of believe, this is how you establish that credibility. And so that is why I made that decision. And it took years after, I got out of the Army and because they were chasing me out. And then I ended up, it took me years of teaching it in the way that I knew it needed to be taught, as I would teach an Army unit that. And I saw the shift taking place in hundreds and then thousands of students, people weeping because for the first time in their lives, they now had empirical evidence to support through their experience that there was something beyond the physical and that they were part of it. And that, my friend, that is what codified in me and allowed me to know why I made that decision, even though I didn't even consciously know that that's why I was making a decision. So now, some 30 years plus later, I have a lot of wisdom that's been gained and a lot of soul searching and learning and seeing tens of thousands of people changed in their lives because of it. That is the story about that. And all that happened as a result of it. So I so hate telling the story about all that, but I understand it needed to be told.
Yeah, from a perspective
it's about now is what I'm really about.
And that's, but we have to key up those things.
Sure.
Right? For people to even understand what's going on, what it's about. Because last night when we sat at the table, we talked again about the web of evil. And I said to you, it's really hard for me to want to believe that. Because I believe that hurt people, heal people, heal people. You're proof of this. You're proof of what I said last night. When people find something bigger than themselves that is worth living for, also in your perspective is worth dying for, and that can bring us together, it doesn't matter how big the military is. We're talking about the U.S. military complex. When we know something, it's really difficult to unsee what we know. And when people can be healed, and what I mean from that, whether it's plant-based medicine, whether it's finding a higher power, where it's a higher purpose, or something that is beyond the physical, people shift. The world shifts. And so more and more people with the work you're doing, the work many people are doing out there to be able to show everybody that, listen, we're part of the collective. We are all one. We're part of the earth. We're part of all of this. We're part of the universe. then all of a sudden, maybe, just maybe, we can stop killing each other in the name of power, greed, money, whatever it might be, that we can justify the need to kill another life. Maybe, just maybe, we can shift those things. And one of the things we talked about earlier today, what I want to talk about now very quickly, not even quickly, but I want to talk about, and that is the quantifiable evidence of what it means to actually move through a moment, what it means to actually attract what we're looking for, not on a way of, like you said, the guy behind the curtain, the woo side of things, which is, but they do tie together, no different than quantum physics. But if we start to tie those things in together of actually what it means, like likeness attracts likeness, what it means that like what we're vibrating internally is actually what we're experiencing externally, and what it means that we're creating this reality moment by moment, choice by choice, all the time, and that our past does not have to dictate our future.
Yeah, I mean, it's you're talking about just one small piece of the groundwork, training is that new remote viewing students are given, because they have to understand certain aspects of the science that back this up. They never gave you that in the remote viewing unit. They were incapable of it. They didn't have any of that. They didn't know how to put it. They didn't even have a manual or a program of instruction or a training outline. But I built that because I wanted students to understand how they're able to do what they do, not just tell them, if you do this, this is what'll happen, and you got to believe that, right? Until you know it. So just talking about the moment, decades ago, from just listening to, because I was teaching in the same places that John Kabat-Zinn and Thich Nhat Hanh and Eckhart Tolle and other stuff, I kept hearing everybody talking about now and being in the moment and being mindfulness in the moment and stuff. And being a scientist again, it was kind of like, well, this shit's got to have something more than that. I mean, it's not about just ringing a bell and bringing people back in to the moment, which Eckhart was doing. I just listened to him lecture one time when we were both at the Omega Institute, and he was like 2 days into a 5-day training, and it was late in the afternoon on the second day, and he had microphones up, and people could come up and ask questions. And a woman came up and stood at the microphone. She goes, "Are you ever going to move on? Are we going to get to like the next thing?" Just thought that was so funny.
Yeah, especially considering who he is.
He just picks the bell up and rings it again, because it's like clearly
you're missing the point.
You're missing the point.
You're missing the point.
So went through this effort. I actually sat down in Norway when I was teaching in Norway, and there was a nuclear submarine captain who was in the class. And we talked a lot because we both had, our backgrounds we had some backgrounds in physics, and we were in science, and we were sitting down trying to talk about this, and we were trying to actually create a model for the moment. But it's extraordinarily difficult to do because, again, you're talking about taking something that actually is not linear, and and it's 8-dimensional, which people struggle with that. But if they look it up online, they can understand a little bit more about what I'm talking about. And how do you take that and put it in a diagram that you can talk to, that people can understand? And when you do that, it's really even more confusing to some people, because you're taking this 8-dimensional model and you're squashing it down into 2-dimension, and that's called an embedded diagram. So in it, you have to discuss things, and I wanted students to understand that, time is not linear. It's tied to space. And it bends and it moves, and it's actually a construct of humanity. It's not necessarily a law, a cosmic law, although we couldn't do anything without it.
Yeah, we use it to our advantage, but it's not a cosmic
Precisely.
law. Correct.
And so in defining the moment, you have to understand the components that go into that. But let's just say that the moment is defined simply by this. It's the sum of change and time, because change and time are what constitute motion, right?
Okay.
So the delta between them. But it is change approaching zero plus time approaching zero. And the other part of the inner equation is that it is change approaching the infinite and time approaching the infinite, okay? The sum of those. But change and time never stop. They never reach zero, and they also never get to the infinite. So what are they moving in? Well, if that defines the moment, what's the moment moving in? It's moving in a holographic matrix field, or it's moving in 8-dimensional space-time. And what it is doing, it's moving through potentials. So there is no looking into the future. There is no looking backward into the past and doing something in the past that changes the present, or going in the future and looking at it. Anybody that's really talking about that, other than just in tools, for changing your thought or your state, it isn't real from a physics perspective. So if you're understanding now that the moment is in constant motion, and if you're grasping the notion that the moment is the only thing you're in charge of, you're not in charge of tomorrow or yesterday or 5 minutes ago or 5 minutes from now. You're only in charge of now. And that was very powerful, but it doesn't get translated in how it's being presented by some of the real, metaphysical teachers. So in understanding that, and it's moving through potentials, infinite potentials, right? So like we said earlier, in putting a visual model together on, you can say it's moving through an entire football stadium filled with ping pong balls. And they're all white ping pong balls, and some have minuses on them for a negative, and the others have positives on it, pluses on them, and they are equal that are out there. And then you understand how simplistic that is, because it's not just positive or negative. There's every potential variant in between all of that.
Anything in between.
Right. So,
correct.
But the moment is moving through that. So what brings the moment then into the kinds of things that you're looking for in your life? It's all about your intention. And I don't say that simplistically. Your intention has to be something you start with in the day. It has to be something that you remind and refresh during the day, because that intention, and you can have many kinds and variants of intention and have them all at once, but it is the intention that causes you to resonate, okay? Your vibration. That resonant frequency that you have causes or looks for sympathetic resonant frequencies as it's moving through this infinite field of potentials.
So sympathetic, are we talking about because likeness attracts likeness, or vibration attracts vibration?
Well, it's not an attraction. It's a fact that it's an entrainment. It's a sympathetic resonance. It means that when one frequency is powerful and has a strong frequency, that means cycles per second, it's hertz. Mm-hmm. So it has a high amplitude, which means the force with which you establish that intention for yourself, the way in which you constantly remind yourself that that's your intention. That is your focused intention. That increases the amplitude, the power of it, the strength of it. Okay. The constant repetition of it as well is what increases the number or the hertz rate of it. So what starts to happen in sympathetic resonance, it's causing other, every potential has its frequency. It's causing other frequencies to resonate with it. And those frequencies or those potentials, they seem to start to, in theory, stack up, okay? You have a pattern of potentials, and a pattern of potentials can have one pattern of potentials. There can be another pattern of potentials because, as we established, lots of different variations in it. But as you're resonating, the power with which you're doing it, these other patterns of potentials are resonating with you as well. So the moment moves into those, and if you're fortunate and all goes well,
moves into, doesn't attract, but moves into, and that's the difference.
Into them.
Because a lot of times we'll say that likeness attracts likeness, right? Attracts, but you're saying moves through it, which is then creating a new moment and a new experience.
Likeness doesn't attract likeness. Likeness can cause other things it can cause them to resonate again.
Got it.
I mean, as we say, opposites attract, but
right.
Likeness doesn't always attract likeness. I mean, it's not a physics property for that to happen. It is when the strength of one waveform is there. Remember, it can be a destructive waveform interference, a constructive waveform interference, or it can be an entrainment through a sympathetic resonance. If there is There's an old Jewish physicist, Itzhak Bentov, wrote a book called Stalking the Wild Pendulum. You got to love this guy. When I was in school, there were guys that were in physics because of reading this book. And he has this funny little way of saying, he goes, we're all just raisins in Jell-O. We're all just raisins in the Jell-O. So when one raisin, because of what he's doing and what's in his heart, like you, and what is in his intention, which is to change humanity in a positive way, you have a resonant frequency that causes other raisins in the Jell-O to start vibrating with exactly the same hertz rate you're vibrating at.
Right.
Because you're vibrating the Jell-O.
Okay.
So you're thereby vibrating them. And the Jell-O is just the environment, where you are out here in this group at Upgrade or any place that you are, and that you're on the microphone and talking and sharing, right? How you lead your company. All those things, you're causing people to resonate with you. When that's happening, you're living powerfully in the moment. These potentials line up for you. But what I want to say is, you have to recognize that how the stronger you are in the resonant, in the now, in the moment to moment, right? That you will get tested, because while the probability distribution, that means like the closer the moment moves to these patterns of potentials, the more likely mathematically that the moment is going to hit that, okay? But there are external factors that can alter that. And this is where the test comes in. There is the individual moment, yours and mine. There is the collective moment of all the individuals together in the world, all at the same time. And Itzhak Bentov talked about this as well. But, just about the resonance of the planet. We live in a capacitor. There's a negative ionic charge on the surface of the Earth. There's a positive ionic charge at the ionosphere, which fluctuates up and down, but roughly about 85 kilometers up. That is a negative and a positive, and it's spherical. It goes all the way around the Earth. That forms a perfect capacitor. A capacitor is an energy storage capability. So now think about all the resonant frequency going on in the world. Everything from, radio transmissions and television transmissions and cell phones, military radios, police radios, everything. Think about that. And
there's a lot of waves.
And
a lot.
Of course. And now think also just about the frequency of all the people that are in the planet. Everything from every 13 seconds a child starving to death, that frequency, on up to people getting married and beginning their life anew, fully in love, embraced, or success in business, or anything like that, right? That frequency is there too. So we exist within a sea, just in the capacitor, the electrostatic field of the planet. We exist in that field, that Jell-O, if you will. And it does cause us to vibrate. It's why the intention field, has to be so strong. It has to be reinforced constantly. If you let go of it, if you don't pay attention, something will affect you. Something will shift you. Something can move you. So that is called change distribution in the model. The world can affect you and skew you out of the moment because chaos enters into your mind, or doubt enters your mind, or anger, something else, a negative that skews you. To potentially be a part of your reality are now skewed because the moment's skewed.
Right.
Make sense? The moment is skewed
Absolutely.
because you took your hands off the wheel. Okay? And that's a really big, important part to teach brand new remote viewing students because they can't take their hands off the wheel.
So the intention, let's dive into that for a second. I talk about intention all the time. It's everything, as you would say. From a remote viewing standpoint in life, right? Not from doing this work, but just from life. How do you hold your intention so strongly that you can't be like knocked off?
Good question. Practice.
As in?
Practice and understanding the consequences, right? It's a hard thing to do. It's not easy. You can turn around and, simple examples. Like if I tell you to, hold the color purple in your head, most people can't do it.
Right.
It changes, it shifts, it goes away, it alters, it light, dark, all this other stuff. It's so strengthening that muscle, the mind, and your ability to do that. It takes time and focus and preparation, desire, right? But you can build it and you can strengthen it. And I just want to say that was a good question, and I really appreciate you asking it and giving me the opportunity to talk about this.
Absolutely. Like you could, I mean, you have a plethora of knowledge. I mean, I spent last night with you and I was like, I don't know where we're going to start tomorrow. Like there's so much in you and there's so much wisdom and so much experience. But I do love what we just talked about as far as about how do we keep that consciousness or how do we keep that intention? Because look, we know there's a lot of evil in the world. We know there's a lot of capitalism out there, as we talked about last night, that's doing some real major harm, whether it's, sex trafficking of children, which is, you were told me last night was the largest industry in the world, whether it's, the pornography or whether it's drugs or whether, there's all these different things which would cause a different frequency on the planet of a residency. And that's why it's so important for people to recognize and see these things, because in order for us to change the planet, it's not up to me. I do my part, right, moment to moment. It's not up to you. You do your part moment to moment. It's up to all of us as a collective. And we all have to see that we're all connected. We all want the same things. And I think as long as we can start to do that more on a worldwide level, not just the United States, and we can see again, like I said, that we are all connected, we are all one, and we can use these techniques like you're talking about from a way of picking a different target. And maybe that target is, how do we improve humanity? What technologies can we put in place that's going to improve humanity? What things can we do that's going to help with starvation of children? We have so many natural resources. We have an abundant world that it's hard for me to fathom that it's not an abundant world. So when I see people think the opposite, it blows me away, because that's the way I view my world. Like internally, this is the way I view my world. It wasn't easy. It was a lot, and continual to be a lot of exercise, a lot of practice, a lot of daily practice, right? We're only as powerful as our daily practices, as you would basically just said. So the thought for me is utilizing these techniques like remote viewing, utilizing things such as meditation, utilizing things to hold our intention that maybe, just maybe, that we can shift this world. But it is going to be up to people that I believe are going to start to change, and I do believe change the world, which are business owners. And the reason they do that is because they're the ones that put money into the system. They're the ones that put employees in place so that they can take care of their families. They're the ones that put technology into place that's going to help create and change humanity. And so with that, I want to say thank you for coming out here. Thank you for giving me your time and energy last night over dinner. Fascinating. But I do believe that we can change the planet. But before we go, what is the one thing you want to be remembered for?
Leaving you with this final idea, which is this: no matter how bleak it looks and the whole web of evil and all those things, those are realities we have to deal with. But never give up hope, and never give up that thought that you can change the planet. Because if you want another scientific example of it, fission theory, 10% of any 10% impurity into any given population can bring about a critical mass and start a chain reaction. So if you want to do that in humanity, then you need to get 10%. I think we have the numbers. And if you get 10% in a combined ideology to change in a positive way the human condition, change the planet, you can start that reach that critical mass and start that chain reaction to make that happen. We're just not all together yet to make that happen. We only need 10%.
Up until now, I know our spiritual capitalists, people listening, I know that they view the world this way. I know that they see that this is where we are going, and it's up to me, it's up to the people around me, it's up to our staff, it's up to everybody else that's involved with these things to take and spread that message that we can have it all, we can have an abundant world, and nobody has to suffer because of it.
Thank you.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you.